The mud river had transformed into a raging, silt-filled surge, its surface churning with the remnants of shattered lives. Tashunka Redbird pressed his spine against the rough bark of an ancient cottonwood that had surrendered to the flood's fury, its massive trunk now serving as his precarious refuge above the freezing grip of the flow. The torrent below roared with a voice that seemed to come from the earth's very bowels, drowning out the desperate lowing of cattle being swept to their deaths and the crash of buildings surrendering to the inexorable current. Blood seeped through the buckskin of his shirt, where the bounty hunter's rifle ball had creased his shoulder blade 36 hours ago. Each breath sent fire through his ribs, courtesy of the beating he'd taken, when 3 men had cornered him in a box canyon near Devil's Ridge. But pain was an old companion now, familiar as his own shadow after 6 days of pursuit through the Badlands. The water below him was thick as gravy, laden with topsoil from 1,000 farms and the detritus of human ambition. Fence posts jutted from the surface like broken teeth, and the bloated carcass of a prize bull drifted past its brand still visible on the distended hide. Through this chaos of destruction, something pale flickered in and out of view, a fragment of white cloth clinging to a piece of timber that spun and bobbed in the vicious current. Tashunka's fingers tightened on the worn handle of his hatchet as he strained to see through the spray and debris. There, clinging to what looked like a piece of barn siding, was a child. A boy no more than 8 years old, his small fists locked around the splintered wood with the desperate grip of the drowning. His head disappeared beneath the surface for long seconds before bobbing up again, gasping and choking. The smart move would be to stay put, to let the river claim its victim and preserve his own hide. Tashunka Redbird was a marked man, hunted by every badge-wearing son of a bitch between here and the territorial capital. The questions he'd been asking about certain prominent citizens' business dealings had made him enemies with deep pockets and long reach. Saving a white child would complicate everything. Maybe get him strung up before he could find the men who'd butchered his people. But as the boy's grip slipped and his small form was dragged under by the relentless current, Tashunka found himself stripping off his knife belt and medicine pouch. Some things ran deeper than strategy, deeper than the survival instinct that had kept him alive through 32 years of frontier warfare. His father's voice echoed in his memory. A warrior's strength is measured not by how many enemies he can kill, but by how many innocent lives he can protect. The boy surfaced again, 50 yards downstream, now his movements growing weaker. In minutes, he would be past the bend, where the river narrowed into a series of deadly rapids. Whatever Tashunka was going to do, it had to be now. He dove without another thought at the icy water hitting his body like a physical blow that drove the breath from his lungs and sent him tumbling in the current. Tashunka Redbird had learned early that the frontier was a graveyard of noble intentions. His father, Standing Bear, had been a war chief who tried to negotiate peace with the advancing tide of white settlers. The old man had died with a treaty in one hand and a bullet in his chest, betrayed by men who spoke of civilization while practicing savagery. His mother, Bright Moon, had survived the forced march to the reservation, only to waste away from grief and government rations that barely kept body and soul together. The scars on Tashunka's torso told the story of his coming of age in this new world. The parallel lines across his chest marked his participation in the sun dance ceremony, performed in secret after the Indian agent had banned all heathen practices. The puckered bullet wound on his left shoulder came from his first encounter with buffalo hunters who'd killed his uncle's horse for sport. The knife scar along his ribs was a souvenir from a claim jumper who tried to take water rights that legally belonged to the tribe, Yao. For 7 years he'd attempted to walk the white man's road. He'd learned to read their language from a missionary's daughter who'd seen humanity in his eyes when others saw only a savage. He'd worked as a scout for the cavalry tracking hostile war parties and rustlers with equal skill. He'd even worn their clothes and eaten their food, swallowing his pride, because it meant his sister's children could attend the government school. But peace was a luxury that men like Benjamin McAllister would never allow. The banker controlled the territorial land office, the local credit unions, and half the politicians in the capital. He'd made his fortune by systematically defaulting mortgages on Indian-owned property, then selling the seized land to railroad companies and cattle syndicates. The web of corruption stretched from the reservation agent's office all the way to Washington, D.C. The packet of letters Tashunka had recovered from a murdered cavalry officer's saddlebags painted a picture that chilled his blood. McAllister had been financing private militias to relocate tribes that stood in the way of profitable development. The most recent communication, dated 12 days ago, had authorized a dawn raid on the Lakota settlement, where Tashunka's nephew lived with his sister's family. When the attack came, it had been swift and merciless. 12 children between the ages of 6 and 14 had been taken officially rescued from an unhealthy environment by court order. 7 adults, including Tashunka's sister Walking Deer, had been shot down while trying to protect their young. The raiders had worn army uniforms and carried official papers making resistance an act of treason. The survivors whispered that the children had been loaded onto a wagon bound for a civilizing school in the east. But Tashunka knew better. Those children would disappear into the vast network of forced labor that fed the territory's mining operations. Some would die from the work, others from disease, and the lucky ones would forget their names and their heritage until they were no longer recognizably human. For 8 days, Tashunka had tracked the men responsible, following a trail of evidence that led inevitably to the prosperous town of Millfield. The settlement sat in a natural depression beside the Mud River, its buildings clustered along the banks like a beaver dam. The location had been chosen for convenience, easy access to water-fertile soil, and a natural ford for crossing. The town's fathers had ignored the warnings of local tribes about the river's tendency to flash flood during the spring rains. Now their arrogance was being washed away in a torrent of mud and broken dreams. The main street lay 20 feet underwater, and the current was strong enough to carry away entire buildings. Through the gray morning light, Tashunka could see the Methodist church steeple spinning slowly as it disappeared around a bend, its brass bell tolling a funeral dirge for the drowned. The river's embrace was like being seized by a giant's fist made of ice and fury. The current tumbled Tashunka end over end, slamming him against submerged fence posts and dragging him through tangles of barbed wire that opened fresh cuts on his arms and face. His wounded shoulder screamed with each impact, sending bolts of agony down his left arm. His lungs burned for air, but each time he fought to the surface, another wave drove him back down into the brown darkness. Something sharp, maybe a broken plow blade, raked across his thigh, parting the buckskin and the flesh beneath. The pain was immediate and intense, but he forced himself to compartmentalize it. Pain was information, nothing more. Information could be processed later when survival wasn't measured in heartbeats. He surfaced in a brief eddy behind a partially submerged water trough, gasping and spitting out a mouthful of muddy water that tasted of death and decay. The boy was 40 yards downstream now, his small form barely visible above the churning surface. The piece of barn siding he clung to was waterlogged and sinking, its buoyancy failing with each passing second. Tashunka struck out across the current, using a technique his grandfather had taught him for crossing swift rivers during the buffalo hunts. Instead of fighting the water directly, he angled his body and let the current carry him while he swam at a diagonal, conserving energy while making progress toward his target. The bloated carcass of a milk cow drifted past, and he grabbed its rigid leg, using the dead animal as a stepping stone to gain precious yards. The boy went under again, and this time he didn't surface for nearly a minute. When his head finally broke the water, his movements were weak and uncoordinated. Hypothermia was setting in, and with it the kind of peaceful drowsiness that preceded death. Tashunka redoubled his efforts, ignoring the growing weakness in his legs and the fire in his shoulder. He was 20 yards away when he saw the barn roof coming. The structure was enormous, easily 50 feet long, and still largely intact, its corrugated metal surface gleaming dully in the overcast light. It moved with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche pushed by the full weight of the flood behind it. Tashunka had perhaps 15 seconds before it crushed them both. He kicked desperately toward the boy, his lungs burning and his vision starting to blur from lack of oxygen. The child was sinking again, his small hands losing their grip on the disintegrating wood. 10 seconds. Tashunka reached out his fingers, brushing the boy's wrist. 5 seconds. He grabbed hold and pulled, wrapping his arm around the small chest, just as the massive roof swept overhead. The displaced water lifted them both toward the jagged metal edge. A loose piece of tin roofing, sharp as a cavalry saber, sliced across Tashunka's forearm as the structure passed, laying open a gash that immediately began streaming blood into the muddy water. The pain was excruciating, but he bit back a Lakota curse and held on to the boy, using his body to shield the child from the worst of the debris. They were carried past the barn roof and into a field of floating wreckage, broken fence posts, chicken coops, the front door of someone's house. Tashunka kicked toward shore, but his strength was failing. The blood loss from his wounds was beginning to tell, and the cold water was sapping what remained of his energy. His grip on the boy was slipping, and he could feel his own consciousness starting to fade. The boy's lips were blue, his breathing shallow and irregular. His eyes had rolled back, showing only white. If they didn't reach shore soon, they would both die in the freezing grip of the flow. Tashunka's feet touched bottom in the shallows, and he half-carried, half-dragged the boy through the knee-deep water to the muddy bank. They collapsed together in the sucking clay, both gasping and shivering. The child's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his breathing was so shallow that Tashunka had to press his ear to the small chest to be sure the heart was still beating. "What's your name, son?" he asked, but the boy's eyes had rolled back completely. Shock, hypothermia, and exhaustion had combined to push him to the very edge of death. As Tashunka lifted the child in his arms, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. There, partially hidden beneath the boy's torn collar, was a small brass badge, the kind given to depositors at the First Bank of Millfield. The bank owned by Benjamin McAllister. For a moment, darker thoughts crept through his mind. But looking at the small, pale face, he knew he could not abandon this child. Whatever connection the boy had to his enemy, he was innocent. Children were always innocent until the world taught them otherwise. The nearest shelter was a line shack, perhaps 2 miles across the flooded plain. Between here and there lay a maze of mud holes, debris fields, and hungry predators drawn by the smell of death. But there was no choice. The boy would die without warmth, and Tashunka would die with him if he didn't start moving. He hoisted the child onto his back and began the long journey into the wasteland. The landscape before them looked like the aftermath of some cosmic battle. What had been fertile farmland that morning was now a sea of chocolate-colored mud, broken by islands of debris. Wagon wheels stuck up from the mire like grave markers, and the corpses of farm animals lay scattered across the devastation. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of death decay and the rich organic scent of displaced topsoil. Tashunka picked his way carefully across the treacherous terrain, using his hatchet as a walking stick to test the ground ahead. The boy's weight pressed against his wounded shoulder, sending bolts of agony down his arm with each step. His forearm wound throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel the warm trickle of blood soaking through his makeshift bandage. The mud was worse than he had anticipated. In places, it was knee-deep, sucking at his moccasins with each step. Twice he stepped into hidden washouts left by the receding water, nearly losing his footing and dumping them both into the mire. The boy's arms tightened around his neck during these moments of peril, a sign that some part of his consciousness remained aware of their danger. They were halfway to the line shack when the storm hit. The sky had been darkening steadily, and now the first drops of rain began to fall. Not the gentle shower of a summer storm, but the heavy driving precipitation that promised violence. Within minutes, The drops had turned to hail, starting small but growing rapidly in size and intensity. The pelting ice barrage struck with increasing force, each stone larger than the last. Tashunka hunched over the boy, using his own body as a shield, but the hailstones found every exposed inch of skin. They pounded his shoulders, his scalp, the back of his neck with bruising force. One particularly large stone caught him just above the left eye, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding down his face, temporarily blinding him. Through the white curtain of falling ice, he caught sight of movement at the periphery of his vision. Low shapes, gray as smoke, padding through the storm with the purposeful gait of predators. Wolves drawn by the scent of blood and death that hung over the valley like a pall. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more, and they were closing in with the patient intelligence of experienced hunters. The boy whimpered against his back, a sound barely audible above the roar of the storm. His skin was cold as marble, and his breathing had become irregular. Tashunka pressed on, ignoring the pain in his shoulder and the growing weakness in his legs. His vision cleared slowly, the blood from his forehead wound, mixing with the ice and rain. Behind him, the wolves matched his pace, neither approaching nor falling back. They could smell his wounds, sense his exhaustion. The alpha male, a big animal with scars around its muzzle, kept pace about 30 yards away, its yellow eyes never leaving Tashunka's face. The hail was growing larger now, some stones the size of hens' eggs. They struck with enough force to raise welts on exposed skin, and Tashunka felt blood trickling down his scalp where several had found their mark. One stone struck his wounded shoulder with such force that he stumbled, nearly dropping the boy. Through the chaos of ice and wind, he saw their salvation, a massive oak tree that had somehow survived the flood. Its trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, and its branches, though stripped of most leaves by the storm, would provide some shelter from the worst of the hail. But as he stumbled toward the tree, the wolves moved to intercept him. The alpha male approached to within 20 feet, its hackles raised and its lips pulled back to reveal yellowed fangs. A low growl rumbled in its throat, and the other pack members began to circle, cutting off his escape routes. Tashunka set the boy down against the oak's massive trunk and faced the wolves. His hatchet felt heavy in his hand, but it was sharp and familiar. Moving slowly, he picked up a stone with his free hand and hurled it at the alpha's head. His aim was true, and the rock caught the animal just above the left eye. It yelped and jumped back, but the others held their ground. The lead wolf shook its head, then charged. Tashunka sidestepped and brought his hatchet down in a short arc, the blade catching the animal in the shoulder. It spun away with a howl of pain, dark blood staining its gray fur. The other wolves hesitated, their predatory confidence shaken by the sight of their leader's injury, but they didn't retreat. They were too hungry, too desperate. The smell of blood was driving them to frenzy, and they knew that their quarry was wounded and exhausted. They began to close in again, moving with the coordinated precision of a pack hunt. Tashunka grabbed another stone and hurled it at the nearest wolf, catching it in the ribs. The animal yelped and backed away, but another took its place. He was running out of ammunition, and his strength was failing. The boy behind him was unconscious, his small body racked with fever and hypothermia. The alpha wolf, its shoulder wound bleeding freely, gathered itself for another charge. Its eyes were wild with pain and rage, and foam flecked its muzzle. Tashunka raised his hatchet, knowing that this might be his last stand. If he fell, the boy would die with him. The wolf leaped its powerful hind legs, propelling it through the air like a gray missile. Tashunka brought his hatchet up to meet it, but at the last second, a sound made the animal twist in midair. A human voice shouting through the storm, "Get away from them." The wolves scattered as rifle shots cracked through the air. Tashunka spun around to see a figure emerging from the storm, a man on horseback, his rifle smoking in his hands. But as the rider drew closer, Tashunka's heart sank. It was Deputy Marcus Holloway, the young lawman who'd been hunting him for days. "Well, well," Holloway said, dismounting with his rifle trained on Tashunka. Looks like I found me a redskin and his prey. The abandoned line shack stood like a broken promise against the storm-darkened sky. Half its roof had been torn away by wind or fire, and the walls were blackened with soot from some long-ago disaster. But it was shelter, and at this moment, shelter was worth more than all the gold in the territorial treasury. Holloway had bound Tushunka's hands with rawhide and forced him to carry the unconscious boy to the shack. The deputy was young, maybe 25, with the kind of carefully waxed mustache that spoke of vanity and inexperience. His badge was tarnished, and his uniform was mud-stained, but his Colt Peacemaker was clean and ready. Set him down over there. Holloway ordered, gesturing toward a relatively dry corner. And don't try anything stupid. I'd hate to have to explain why I shot an unarmed man. Tushunka laid the boy on the cleanest spot he could find and knelt beside him. The child's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and his breathing was so shallow that his chest barely moved. Without warmth and medical attention, he would be dead within hours. Kid's in bad shape, Holloway observed, studying the boy's face. What did you do to him? Nothing, Tushunka replied. Pulled him out of the river. He was drowning. Sure you did, Holloway said with a sneer. Just like you were helping all those other kids you stole from the reservation. I didn't steal anybody. I'm trying to find them. That's what they all say. Holloway knelt beside the boy and turned back his collar. His expression changed as he read the embroidered name. Jesus Christ. This is Daniel McAllister, the banker's boy. Tushunka's blood ran cold. He'd known the boy was connected to McAllister, but hearing the name spoken aloud made it real. No, you kidnapped Benjamin McAllister's son. Holloway continued, his voice rising with excitement. Do you have any idea what kind of reward there's going to be for bringing you in? I saved him, Tushunka insisted. From the flood. He was drowning. No. And I'm supposed to believe that an Indian just happened to save a white boy out of the goodness of his heart. In his delirium, the boy began to mumble. Papa. Papa said. Keep it secret. Hide it from the bad men. Holloway leaned closer. What's he saying? Fever talk, Tushunka said. Means nothing. But the deputy's attention was focused on the boy's words. Papa said keep what's secret. What's he talking about? Daniel's small hands clutched at something beneath his shirt. The bag. Papa's bag. Don't let the bad men find it. Holloway reached under the boy's shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside were gold coins and folded papers. The deputy's eyes widened as he examined the contents. What is this stuff? He muttered, unfolding one of the documents. Bank records, correspondence. Jesus, there's names here. Important names. Tushunka recognized some of the signatures: territorial officials, federal judges, men whose corruption had enabled McAllister's crimes. The boy had been carrying evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy. And this is it, Holloway said, his voice filled with awe. This is the proof everyone's been looking for. The corruption, the land fraud, all of it. He looked up at Tushunka with new respect. You really did save him, didn't you? From the flood. I told you. But why? Why risk your life for a white boy? Especially this white boy. Tushunka looked down at Daniel's pale face. Because he's just a child. Because someone had to. Holloway was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. Finally, he spoke. This changes things. If this boy dies, these papers die with him. And if these papers die, a lot of guilty men go free. Tushunka finished. Yeah. Holloway untied Tushunka's bonds. Looks like we're going to have to work together. The storm raged outside the shack for 3 more hours, the wind howling through the gaps in the walls and the rain drumming against the remaining roof. Tushunka tended to the boy's wounds, while Holloway kept watch. His attitude toward the Indian, gradually shifting from suspicion to grudging respect. "Tell me about the raid," Holloway said during a lull in the storm. "What really happened?" Tashunka's voice was steady as he recounted the events. "They came at dawn. 20 men in army uniforms with official papers. Said they were there to rescue the children from an unhealthy environment. And you believed them?" "My sister did. She was the school teacher educated in the white man's ways. She trusted the law, trusted the government, right up until they shot her in the back." Holloway winced. "I'm sorry. 7 dead. 12 children taken. The survivors were told that resistance would be considered an act of war against the United States. And you've been hunting the men responsible ever since?" "For 8 days, the trail led to McAllister, the boy's father." Tashunka nodded. "The man who ordered the raid. The man who paid for my sister's death." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the storm. Finally, Holloway spoke again. "What are you going to do now, when this is over?" "Find the children, bring them home. And if they're already dead, then I'll bury them properly. And I'll make sure the men responsible pay for what they've done." Daniel stirred in his makeshift bed, his fever-bright eyes opening to focus on Tashunka's face. "You're still here," he whispered. "I'm still here," Tashunka confirmed. "How do you feel?" "Better. Warmer." The boy struggled to sit up. "Are you really an Indian?" "Yes. Papa said Indians were dangerous. Said they'd steal children and hurt people." "Some might. Just like some white men might steal children and hurt people." Daniel considered this. "Papa hurt people, didn't he? That's what the papers are about." Tashunka was surprised by the boy's insight. "What do you know about the papers?" "I heard Papa talking to other men. They were scared about something. Papa told me to keep the bag safe, to hide it if the bad men came." "Did you know what was in the bag?" "Money, and papers about the children Papa took from the Indian school." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Even at his young age, Daniel had known that his father was involved in something wrong. "I'm sorry," the boy said quietly. "About the children, about what Papa did. You're not responsible for your father's actions." Tashunka replied. "But you can choose to be different." "I want to be different. I want to be good." "Then you will be." By the time the storm passed, Daniel's fever had broken and his breathing had stabilized. Holloway had made a decision that would change all their lives. "We're going to town," he announced. "All of us, together." "They'll lynch me on sight," Tashunka said. "Not if I'm with you. Not if the boy testifies about what really happened." A child's word against a mob's rage. A child's word backed by documentary evidence of corruption that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. Tashunka looked at Daniel, who was listening with the intense concentration of a child trying to understand adult problems. "You ready for this, son?" "I'm ready," Daniel said with quiet determination. "I want to tell the truth about Papa, about what he did." The journey to Millfield took 4 hours on foot, with Daniel riding on Tashunka's shoulders for much of the way. The boy's condition had improved dramatically, and he chattered constantly about everything he saw: the damage from the flood, the animals they encountered, the way the sun looked as it broke through the clouds. But as they approached the town, his mood grew more somber. The devastation was worse than any of them had imagined. Entire blocks had been swept away, leaving only foundations and debris. Bodies lay scattered among the wreckage, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. "My house," Daniel said softly, pointing to a pile of rubble that had once been the McAllister mansion. "It's gone." "I'm sorry," Tashunka said. "Mama and Papa are in there, aren't they? And my little sister?" "Yes." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I should be sad," he said finally. "But I'm not. Is that wrong?" "No," Tashunka replied. "You feel what you feel. There's no right or wrong to it." The church had survived the flood, its stone walls intact despite the water damage. Smoke rose from its chimney, and they could see people moving about inside. The Red Cross had arrived along with territorial officials and federal marshals. "There's Marshal Harrison," Holloway said, pointing to a tall man with graying hair. "He's a good man. Fair. He'll listen to reason." But as they approached the church, a crowd began to gather. Word of their arrival spread quickly, and soon they were surrounded by angry townspeople who had lost everything in the flood. They needed someone to blame, and an Indian with a white child was a perfect target. "That's him," someone shouted. "That's the redskin who took the boy." "String him up," another voice called out. Holloway drew his gun, but he was outnumbered 50-1. The crowd pressed closer, their faces ugly with rage and grief. "Wait," Daniel's voice cut through the angry murmur. "Stop." The crowd hesitated, surprised by the boy's intervention. "This man saved me." Daniel continued, his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. "He pulled me out of the water when I was drowning. He took care of me when I was sick. He's not bad. He's good." "Don't listen to him," someone shouted. "The Redskins got him confused, scared." "I'm not confused," Daniel said firmly. "And I'm not scared. I know what happened. I know what Papa did." He pulled out the leather pouch and held it up for all to see. "Papa took children from the Indian school. He paid men to hurt people. It's all here in these papers." The crowd fell silent, stunned by the boy's words. Marshal Harrison pushed through the press of bodies, his hand on his holstered gun. "That's a serious accusation, son," he said gently. "Are you sure about what you're saying?" "I'm sure," Daniel replied. "I heard Papa talking to other men. They were scared about getting caught. Papa told me to keep the bag safe, to hide it if the bad men came." Harrison took the pouch and examined its contents. His expression grew darker with each document he read. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. This is extensive." "My brother was a thorough man," a voice said from the crowd. "Even in his corruption." Everyone turned to see a woman pushing through the press of bodies. She was perhaps 40 years old, with the same blue eyes as Daniel, but a face marked by suffering and determination. "Aunt Margaret." Daniel ran to her, and she swept him up in her arms. "I'm Margaret McAllister," she said, addressing the crowd. "Benjamin's sister, and I can confirm that everything this child is saying is true." The crowd began to murmur uncertainly. The story was taking unexpected turns, and their simple narrative of Indian villainy was falling apart. "My brother was a criminal," Margaret continued, "a murderer and a thief. And this man," she gestured toward Tashunka, "is a hero who saved my nephew's life." "Like she's lying," someone shouted. "She's in cahoots with the redskin." "No," Daniel said firmly. "She's telling the truth. Papa was bad. He hurt people. But this man, his name is Tashunka, he saved me. He's good." Marshal Harrison had finished reading the documents. "These papers contain evidence of systematic fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder," he announced. "There are names here, important names. Federal judges, territorial officials, businessmen. This is going to shake the territory to its foundations." He looked at Tashunka with new respect. "You've been hunting the men responsible for the reservation raid." "Yes, sir. And you saved this boy's life, knowing he was the son of your enemy." "I saved him because he needed saving, because he's just a child." Harrison nodded slowly. "The charges against you are dropped. You're free to go." But the crowd wasn't satisfied. They had lost their homes, their livelihoods, their sense of security. They needed someone to blame, and simple justice wasn't enough to satisfy their bloodlust. "No," someone shouted. "We want him to pay. We want justice." "You want revenge," Harrison corrected. "That's not the same thing." The crowd pressed closer, their mood turning ugly. Tashunka could see the hate in their eyes, the desire for violence that transcended reason. This was how lynch mobs were born. Not from justice, but from fear and loss, the need to make someone pay. Get inside, Harrison ordered. All of you. The church will be neutral ground until this gets sorted out. But the crowd had other ideas. They surged forward, grabbing for Tashunka with grasping hands. He fought back, his hatchet appearing in his hand as if by magic. The first man to reach him went down with a broken nose, the second with a gash across his forehead. Stop! Daniel's voice cut through the chaos. Leave him alone. But the crowd was beyond reason now. They had their villain, and they were determined to have their justice. Tashunka found himself fighting for his life in the shadow of the church, his hatchet dancing in the afternoon sun as he held off a dozen attackers. It was Margaret who saved him, stepping between Tashunka and the crowd with her arms spread wide. Enough, she shouted. This man saved my nephew's life. He's not your enemy. Get out of the way, lady. Someone snarled. This don't concern you. It concerns me more than anyone. Margaret replied. That boy is my family, my responsibility. And I'm telling you that this man is a hero. For a moment, the crowd hesitated. Then someone threw a rock, and the violence erupted anew. Tashunka grabbed Margaret and Daniel, pulling them toward the church doors as the mob surged forward. They made it inside, just as the first shots were fired. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut, and Harrison's deputies took up positions at the windows. Outside, the crowd howled for blood, their voices carrying clearly through the stone walls. How long can we hold them? Margaret asked. As long as we have to, Harrison replied. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. The siege lasted through the night and into the next day. The crowd outside grew larger as word spread throughout the valley, drawing men from other towns who had heard about the Indian who had kidnapped the banker's son. By dawn, there were nearly 100 armed men surrounding the church, their faces twisted with rage and alcohol. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but determined. The Red Cross volunteers continued to tend to the flood victims, while Harrison's deputies maintained their watch at the windows. Tashunka sat with Daniel and Margaret, the unlikely trio bonded by shared danger. Tell me about your family, Margaret said to Tashunka. About the children who were taken. Tashunka's voice was steady as he spoke of his sister, of his nephew, Little Wolf, of the other children who had been stolen in the raid. Daniel listened with the wide-eyed attention of a child hearing about a world beyond his own experience. They're still alive, Tashunka said. The papers in the boys' bags show where they were sent. Colorado mining camps mostly. Dangerous work, but they're alive. We'll find them, Margaret promised. When this is over, we'll find them and bring them home. Why? Tashunka asked. Why would you help me? Because it's the right thing to do. Because I'm ashamed of what my brother did. Because I want to make amends. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. New voices were joining the crowd, angrier voices, drunker voices. Someone had brought whiskey, and the mob was working itself into a killing frenzy. They're getting restless, Harrison observed. I don't know how much longer we can hold them. As if in response to his words, the first rock crashed through a window. Then another. The crowd was testing their defenses, probing for weakness. We need to get them out of here, Harrison said. The boy and his aunt, at least, they don't deserve to die for this. None of us deserve to die for this, Margaret replied. But running won't solve anything. Those men out there need to hear the truth. The truth. Harrison laughed bitterly. They don't want the truth. They want blood. Another window shattered, and Daniel moved closer to Tashunka. I'm scared, he whispered. So am I, Tashunka admitted. But fear can make you strong if you let it. Will you tell me a story about your people? Tashunka began to speak, his voice low and soothing. He told Daniel about the old days when the Lakota followed the buffalo across the endless plains. He spoke of his grandfather, who had counted coup on enemy warriors and been honored by the tribe. He told of the sun dance, where young men proved their courage by dancing for days without food or water. As he spoke, other people in the church began to listen. The Red Cross volunteers, the flood victims, even some of Harrison's deputies. They were hearing about a world they had never known, a culture they had been taught to despise. "Your grandfather sounds brave," Daniel said when the story ended. He was, but he was also kind. He taught me that a warrior's greatest strength is not in his weapons, but in his heart. "Is that why you saved me, because of your heart?" "Yes, and because you reminded me of someone I lost." "Your nephew?" "Yes, little Wolf. He's about your age with the same curious eyes." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "When we find him, can I meet him? Can we be friends?" "I'd like that," Tushunka said. "I'd like that very much." Outside, the crowd was growing more agitated. Someone had brought rope, and they were talking about trees and justice. The siege was about to become a massacre. "We can't wait any longer," Harrison said. "We need to move now while we still can." But as he spoke, a new sound reached their ears, the rumble of thunder growing louder by the moment, and underneath it, another sound, the rush of water. "Oh God," Margaret breathed. "Not again." The second flood was coming. The water came not as a sudden wall, but as a slow, inexorable tide. It began as a trickle in the church basement, then spread across the floor like spilled oil. The crowd outside didn't notice it at first. They were too focused on their grim business. But gradually, the rising water demanded their attention. "What the hell?" someone shouted from outside. "Where's this water coming from?" Tushunka peered through a broken window and saw the truth. The dam upstream had failed, weakened by the first flood and finished by the continuing rains. The entire weight of the reservoir was pouring down the valley, and Millfield was directly in its path. "We need to get to higher ground," Harrison said. "Now." But the crowd outside was in chaos. The water was rising faster than they had expected, and panic was beginning to set in. Some men were running for their horses, others were trying to salvage their weapons. The careful organization of the lynch mob was disintegrating into every man for himself. "The bell tower," Margaret said. "If we can get to the bell tower, we might be safe." They began to climb the narrow stairs, carrying the wounded and the children. The water was knee-deep now and rising fast. Outside, they could hear screams and shouts as the crowd was scattered by the flood. From the bell tower, they could see the true scope of the disaster. The entire valley was filling with water, and the current was strong enough to carry away buildings. The mob that had been howling for blood was now struggling for survival, their horses panicking as the water rose around them. Daniel pointed to a group of men who were trapped on the roof of a partially collapsed building. "They're going to drown." "Serves them right," one of the deputies muttered. "No," Tushunka said firmly. "No one deserves to drown." Before anyone could stop him, he was climbing down from the bell tower. The water was waist-deep now, and the current was strong, but he was a skilled swimmer. He struck out toward the trapped men, fighting the flow with powerful strokes. "Come back!" Margaret shouted. "It's too dangerous." But Tushunka was already at the building, helping the first man into the water. The would-be lynchers stared at him in amazement as he guided them to safety, one by one. The man who had been leading the mob was the last to be rescued, his face a mask of shame and confusion. "Why?" the man asked as Tushunka pulled him through the water. "Why save me? I was going to kill you." "Because it was the right thing to do," Tushunka replied. "Because someone had to." By the time they reached the church, the water had risen to the second floor. The bell tower was now an island in a sea of brown water, and the survivors clung to each other for warmth and comfort. "How long will it last?" Daniel asked, watching the water swirl around the church walls. Until the reservoir is empty, Harrison said. Could be hours, could be days. We'll wait, Margaret said. We've waited this long. As the sun set over the flooded valley, the survivors settled in for a long night. The violence and hatred of the day seemed distant, now washed away by the cleansing power of the flood. In the face of natural disaster, the artificial divisions between races and classes seemed meaningless. I'm sorry, the mob leader said to Tashunka, for what I tried to do, for what I said. Apology accepted, Tashunka replied. But don't apologize to me. Apologize to your children. Make sure they grow up better than we did. I will, I promise. As the night wore on, Daniel fell asleep in Tashunka's arms. The boy's breathing was steady and peaceful, and his fever had not returned. He would live, would grow up to become whatever fate had in store for him. He's going to be special, Margaret said quietly. This experience, what he's learned from you, it's going to shape him. All children are special, Tashunka replied. We just don't always give them the chance to show it. What will you do now, when the water goes down? Now find the missing children. Use the evidence in Daniel's bag to bring down the conspiracy. Try to build something better from the ruins. And after that, Tashunka looked down at the sleeping boy in his arms. I don't know, but I think the path will show itself. The floodwaters continue to rise, but in the bell tower of the Methodist Church, something new was being born. Not just friendship across racial lines, but understanding. Not just survival, but hope. And in the morning, when the waters finally began to recede, they would all be changed. The boy would be wiser, the woman would be stronger, and the warrior would be at peace. The flood had taken much, but it had also given them something precious, proof that even in the darkest times, humanity could prevail. The investigation that followed took 4 months to complete, but the results were devastating for the corruption network. The documents from Daniel's bag, combined with testimony from the surviving conspirators, revealed a web of criminal activity that reached from the local level all the way to Washington, D.C. 11 men were arrested, including 2 federal judges, a territorial governor, and several prominent businessmen. The stolen children were located and returned to their families, though the trauma they had endured would take years to heal. Tashunka was reunited with his nephew Little Wolf, who had been working in a Colorado silver mine under conditions that would have killed him within months. Tashunka received not only a full pardon, but also a position as special liaison between the territorial government and the tribal councils. It was difficult work requiring him to navigate the complex politics of both worlds, but it was honest work that made a real difference in the lives of his people. Margaret McAllister became a teacher and advocate for Indian rights, using her brother's ill-gotten wealth to establish schools and medical clinics on the reservations. The people called her Woman Who Speaks Truth, and she wore the name with pride. Daniel grew up in his aunt's care, shaped by the memory of the man who had saved his life. He excelled in his studies, learning to speak Lakota as fluently as English. When he came of age, he became a lawyer, specializing in cases involving Native American rights and territorial justice. The friendship between Tashunka and Daniel deepened over the years. They would spend hours talking about justice, about the future, about the kind of world they wanted to build. Daniel would visit the reservation regularly, and Tashunka would tell him stories of the old days when the plains were wild and the buffalo ran free. 20 years after the flood, Daniel, now a successful attorney with children of his own, proposed a memorial to commemorate the disaster and its aftermath. The statue would show a Native American warrior pulling a child from rushing water, their faces turned toward the future with hope rather than fear. The memorial was controversial, as such things often are. Some complained that it glorified an Indian who had been a wanted man, while others argued that it ignored the real victims of the flood. But Daniel and Margaret persisted, and their influence in the community was enough to overcome the objections. The dedication ceremony took place on a warm spring day, exactly 20 years after the flood. The statue stood in the center of the rebuilt mill field, its bronze surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. A crowd had gathered survivors of the flood, their children and grandchildren, curious onlookers and officials from the territorial government. Tashunka stood with Margaret and Daniel watching as the crowd grew. His hair was gray now, his face lined with age, but his eyes were still sharp and alert. He had lived to see his people's fortunes improve, to witness the gradual recognition of Indian rights, to watch Daniel grow into a man of integrity and compassion. "Do you think Papa would be proud?" Daniel asked, looking at the statue. "I think your father would be amazed," Tashunka replied. "Amazed that his son became everything he was not." "And what about you? Are you proud of what we've accomplished?" Tashunka considered the question. The world had changed dramatically since that terrible day by the river. The frontier was disappearing, replaced by cities and railroads and the institutions of modern civilization. But the fundamental challenges remain the same. How to build trust between different peoples, how to create justice from the chaos of competing interests, how to ensure that the next generation would be better than the one that came before. "I'm proud of you," he said finally, "of the man you've become, of the work you're doing, of the bridge you're building between our worlds." "We're building it together," Daniel corrected. "You, me, Aunt Margaret, everyone who believes that people can change, that the future can be better than the past." The ceremony began with a speech from the territorial governor, who praised the courage of ordinary citizens during the flood. Then Margaret spoke, telling the story of the statue and its meaning. Finally, Daniel addressed the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "This memorial is not just about the flood," he said. "It's about the choices we make when disaster strikes. It's about the courage to save a stranger, the wisdom to forgive an enemy, the strength to build something better from the ruins of what came before." He paused, looking directly at Tashunka. 20 years ago, a man made a choice that changed my life and the lives of everyone here. He chose mercy over revenge, hope over hatred, love over fear. His name was Tashunka Redbird, and he is my friend." The crowd applauded, and Tashunka felt tears prick his eyes. He had never expected to live to see such a day, when an Indian and a white man could stand together as equals, when the children of enemies could become friends, when the future seemed brighter than the past. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Tashunka found himself standing alone before the statue. The sculptor had captured the moment perfectly, the desperation in the warrior's eyes, the trust in the child's face, the rushing water that threatened to sweep them both away. But he had also captured something else, the moment when two people from different worlds had found common ground in their shared humanity. Daniel's son, now 10 years old, approached shyly. "Grandfather Tashunka," he said, using the title that had been bestowed by the family. "Will you tell me the story about the flood and the brave warrior?" Tashunka smiled, feeling the weight of years and the lightness of hope in equal measure. "Come then," he said, settling onto a bench beside the statue. "Let me tell you about the day the world was washed away and how we built it back again stronger than before." As he began to speak, other children gathered around, drawn by the promise of adventure and the magic of storytelling. But this was more than just a tale of rescue and heroism. It was a story about the choices that define us, the connections that sustain us, and the hope that carries us forward into an uncertain but promising future. The water was cold. Tashunka began his voice, carrying the weight of memory and the promise of tomorrow. "So cold it took your breath away. But sometimes when someone needs help, you dive in anyway. You dive in because it's the right thing to do, because someone has to, because that's what it means to be human." The children listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide with wonder. They were hearing more than just a story. They were learning about courage, about sacrifice, about the power of one person to change the world. And as the sun set over the peaceful town, Tashunka knew that his story, their story, would continue long after he was gone. The bridge they had built would carry others across the troubled waters of their own time toward a future where the children of all nations could grow up in peace and understanding. The flood had taken much, but it had also given them something precious, proof that even in the darkest times, humanity could prevail. That courage was contagious, that mercy was powerful, and that the bonds between people could survive any storm. The river flowed on, carrying its burden of memory toward the sea. But the bridge remained connecting two shores that had once seemed impossibly far apart. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the storm, but the shelter. Not the flood, but the rescue. Not the hatred, but the love that conquered it. The boy had been saved, the truth had been told, and the future was bright with possibility. The rest, as they say, was just water under the bridge.